The Big Short is a film about the recent economic crisis and some of the people who made money and lost money on it. It moves through that world of Wall Street and high finance that, for all I understand of it, might as well be located on Mars. Before I saw the movie, I went on the internet and read a synopsis of it, and I didn't understand 70% of what I read. Thankfully, in the movie, every time the characters use one of those cryptic financial terms, the screen will display a definition. Or several times they simply stop the story so that someone can demonstrate and explain what's being discussed in the movie. I really appreciated that. Really appreciated that. The narrative centers around an eccentric hedge fund manager named Michael Burry, played by Christian Bale, who saw the impending housing market collapse 3 years before it actually happened, and he figured out a way to profit from it. Another hedge fund manager named Mark Baum, played by Steve Carell, is convinced to get in on the scheme, and as Baum goes deeper and deeper, he realizes that the fraud and deceit and short-sightedness and greed driving the housing bubble could cause nothing less than the collapse of the entire global economy. And we all know it actually came pretty close to that. Burry and Baum and some of the other characters make a ton of money on the bank failures, but many of them, especially Baum, end with their faith in the system completely shattered. Now, as I watched The Big Short, I wondered, is this really the way the world of investing is like at the higher echelons? I asked that rhetorical question at 8:15, and about half the crowd said yes. I mean, do they really sit around tables and figure out ways to rake in millions of dollars without ever thinking about the long-term consequences? Do they really never consider how their actions will affect other people farther down the food chain? Do they really treat their financial products like pieces on a chessboard, as if their choices are isolated from any moral reference? The Big Short portrays them that way. Obviously, some of them have consciences, but others, meh. Maybe I'm naive. Maybe this is the way it has to be in a capitalist economy. All I know is what Moses said to the Israelites before they crossed into the Promised Land. He told them that their new home would produce abundantly for them. They would build fine houses. Their flocks and herds would multiply. Their crops would yield more food than they had ever seen in their entire lives. But then he warned them, do not exalt yourself, forgetting the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Do not say to yourself, my power and the might of my own hand have gotten me this wealth. Remember the Lord your God, for He is the one who gives you power to get wealth. See, evidently God doesn't have a problem with us getting rich, as long as we don't develop amnesia about where it all came from. When we start isolating ourselves from the God who cares about each of us, not just those with the big bucks, that's when situations like those portrayed in The Big Short begin. So I'm not going to stand up here this morning and rant and rave and scream about the dirty, rotten 1%ers, because I too easily fall prey to spiritual amnesia too. I quickly forget where my resources come from. Bart Simpson is simply expressing the financial theology I tend to practice when he sits at the supper table and bows his head and says, "Dear God, we paid for all this stuff ourselves, so thanks for nothing." I'd never be so crass. Neither would you. We find ways to paper over our spiritual amnesia, and then life becomes just the pursuit of more and more stuff. The more you amass, the more you have to have. Not once in The Big Short did anybody say, I'm not going to do this because I've got enough? No, it was all about getting more and more and more and more. Our consumer society teaches us to define ourselves in terms of what we amass, not in terms of who we are as children of God. René Descartes said, I think, therefore I am, but the culture of The Big Short says, I consume, therefore I am. The Apostle Paul spoke of those whose end is destruction, their God is their belly, and their glory is in their shame. And again, it's not just the Wall Street fat cats, it filters down to all of us. When I was a hospice chaplain, I went to visit a new patient who lived with his wife and his daughter and his granddaughter in the most cluttered house I've ever seen in my entire life. Every single horizontal space had things sitting on it. Knick-knacks, stacks of papers, magazines, small appliances, tools, plates, cups, friendly woodland creatures, a stray in-law or two. There was no empty space on the dining room table. There was no empty space on the baby grand piano. And if you wanted to sit down in a chair or a sofa, you had to move some stuff on top of other stuff in order to sit down. The wife said, I'm sorry for the mess, chaplain, but my husband being sick, I haven't had time to clean this place up. And I thought to myself, this old boy must have been ill since 1961. It takes a long time to amass that kind of clutter. Now, I'm sure your house isn't that cluttered. If mine was that cluttered, they'd have to put me in a loony bin. But my life is just as cluttered in other ways. When Penny and I got married, we merged two households and we got rid of a lot of duplicates. But even so, when we moved here to Elgin, the movers had to go and get a second truck. One of the movers said, you got too much stuff. And I told him to mind his own business and pick up another box. But I knew he was right. I listen to the siren call of our consumer culture way too often. Maybe I'm like that gal that Penny and I met in Louisiana when we were in New Orleans a couple of weeks ago. We wandered into this shoe store, and there was a gal in there having a big argument with the sales clerk. She wanted a pair of alligator shoes, and she wasn't getting the kind of deal on them that she thought she could get. And finally, she just snapped, well, then I'll go down to the swamp and catch an alligator and get me some alligator shoes for free. Well, later that afternoon, Penny and I went out on a swamp tour, which you can take is fascinating, by the way. And when we got to the swamp, I looked out there, and sure, lo and behold, there was that woman standing waist deep in the water with a shotgun in her hand. There were 7 dead alligators all out on the bank, all of them belly up. And then we saw this 9-foot alligator swim rapidly toward her, and with lightning reflexes, she took aim and boom, shot the creature, hauled it up onto the bank beside the others, and took a good look at it and said, oh no, this one's barefoot too. I'm not going to apologize. Reel just some of you in. I guess some people will do just about anything to get the stuff we're told we're supposed to have. It's what happens when we develop spiritual amnesia. When we forget where our resources come from, we also forget that people are human beings just like we are. And then they become nothing more than commodities. I want to know, when did businesses go from having personnel departments to human resources departments? There's a big difference. In The Big Short, only Mark Baum recognizes that he isn't just dealing with numbers on a page. He's dealing with actual human lives. He's the only one who foresees the endless rows of for sale signs and foreclosure signs dotting subdivisions all over America. Some of the other characters regret what happens, even are very sorry about it, but it's all after the fact. Loss of jobs and homes and relationships, even lives to some of them, however, is just collateral damage. They've forgotten where their resources came from, and so they've forgotten their connection with their fellow human beings. Now, again, the Bible doesn't have a problem with people making money. The Bible does have a problem with people making money at the expense of other people's lives. Several places, for example, in the Old Testament, you'll find verses similar to Exodus 22:25, which says, "If you lend money to my people, to the poor among you, you shall not deal with them as a creditor. You shall not exact interest from them." Now, do you know why the Bible forbids charging interest on a loan? It was because in the ancient world, the only reason most people ever borrowed money was in the case of a huge calamity. Their house burned down, their whole crop failed, that sort of thing. And so to charge interest on that kind of a loan, therefore, meant that the lender was making a profit off of somebody else's misery, and God says, you can't do that. Of course, nowadays, people borrow money for a variety of different reasons, most of them not catastrophic, and it's perfectly fine to charge interest on that, but the principle is still the same. If you or I enter into financial practices that deliberately profit from someone else's misery, God doesn't look kindly on that. It's treating people as commodities, not as human beings. When my dad was a little boy, they lived in a ramshackle house there in North Georgia. And my grandpa got really sick, and he couldn't work for a long time. Couldn't earn any money building church furniture, which was where he got most of his livelihood, nor could he make any money, nor could he preach at the local Baptist church, which didn't pay him hardly anything. Well, as a result, he fell way behind on his house payments. Well, one day, a member of Grandpa's church showed up at the house. His name was Cliff. My grandma said, "What can I do for you, Cliff?" And he said, "Well, nothing. I just came to look over the house I just bought." He had gone down to the bank, paid the note on the house, and suddenly, my dad and his family were out on their ear. Now, I'm sure it was a shrewd business deal. I'm sure he made a nice chunk of change on it. But he treated my father and my aunts and my uncles and my grandparents like commodities. Financial shenanigans in The Big Short were shrewd business deals, and lots of people got even richer off of them, but they saw the human cost too late. Because of spiritual amnesia, they saw their resources as personal possessions, and when life becomes a possession, consumption becomes the goal, and people become commodities. Moses wants us to see our resources as an inheritance from God. Everything we have is a gift from God. Those two perspectives are poles apart. Either your life and your resources are a possession or they're an inheritance. Jesus told a story about a man who was beaten and robbed on the road to Jericho. And you know the story. The first two men who came along refused to help. The third man, a Samaritan, stopped to help. Martin Luther King Jr. once said, those first two men asked, "If I stop and help that man, what's in it for me?" And so they passed by on the other side. But the third man, the Samaritan, came along and asked, "If I stop and help that man, what's in it for him?" And he stopped to share what he had. When you treat your resources and even life itself as a possession, you'll gaze at that man as his life ebbs away on the side of the road and ask, "What's in it for me?" And of course, there's nothing in it for you. There's no profit to be made. There's no lucrative deal to negotiate. But when you treat your resources and even life itself as an inheritance, as a gift from God, you will gaze at that fellow human being and ask, what's in it for him? It won't make you rich. But then again, maybe it will. After a fashion. As Easter approached in the year of 1946, the pastor of a small church said to his congregation, now on Easter Sunday, we're going to take up a special offering to help a poor family in our community, and I hope you will all give sacrificially. Well, a family in the church by the name of Ogun, a single mom with 3 daughters, Darlene, Eddie, and Osie, they took the pastor's challenge to heart. And they went home and they scrimped and they saved and they did odd jobs and they did without things. They ate potatoes for just about every meal for the next month so that they could earn some money and donate to help this poor family. When Easter Sunday came along, none of those children or the mom had a new dress for Easter, but they didn't care. The Ogun family had scraped together $70 whole. They had 3 $20 bills and a $10 bill, and they put that in the offering for that poor family. And when they got home, they were singing and they were so happy. Late that afternoon, the pastor drove up in the yard. He spoke with Mom at the door for a few minutes, and when he left, she walked back into the house with a strange look on her face and an envelope in her hand. Darlene said, what did the preacher want, Mama? And without a word, she just dumped that envelope over on its side, and out fluttered 3 $20 bills and a $10 bill and 17 $1 bills. The room fell silent. All of a sudden, they went from feeling like millionaires to feeling like trash. And the worst of it was the girls now realized they were poor. They'd never known it before. They knew they didn't have a lot of things other people did, but they thought it was fun to share silverware and guess who would get the spoon or fork each night. They never thought twice about passing around the only 2 knives they had. They never knew they were poor. For the rest of the week, the light had gone out of their lives. They went to school, they came home, but there was no laughter or singing like before. Mom asked them one night, girls, what do you want to do with this money? But nobody said anything. I mean, what do poor people do with money? Sunday morning came and the girls didn't want to go to church, but Mom insisted. And the speaker that morning was a missionary working in Africa who talked about churches made of sun-dried bricks. And he said they needed money to buy roofs that wouldn't wash away in the rain. He said $100 would put a roof on a church. And the pastor said, can't we all sacrifice to help these poor people in Africa? And for the first time in a week, a smile crept across the faces of the Ogun family. Mom pulled that envelope out of her purse, handed it to Darlene, who handed it to Eddie, who handed it to Osie, who put it in the offering plate. And when the offering was counted, the pastor announced that it was a little over $100. And the Ogun family knew they had contributed 87 of that amount. The missionary said, gosh, I wasn't expecting such a huge offering from such a small church. You must have some really rich people in this church. And from then on, the Ogans never felt poor again. They knew they were the rich people in church. Gosh, I wish I could be rich like that. How about you?